Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Conscious Migration. You know me, I am Ian, and today I'm very excited to be speaking with Mark Certo. Mark Certo he was a sound engineer for a place that many of you have probably heard about, but we've never discussed on this channel. It's an institute called the MONROE Institute, which Mark, I'm sure, is going to tell us a little bit more about. He's also the creator of an online learning program called the TRIAD Mind, which it sounds like he's also going to be teaching at the MONROE Institute, something else he'll be expanding on a bit. And he's the host of the podcast Expanding on Consciousness. Mark, welcome. How are you?
Ian, I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you for taking some time with me. I appreciate it. Certo, I have that pronounced correctly, I assumed, but
That is correct. No, in my
making
neighborhood when
sure.
I grew up in Staten Island, New York. So up there where they would say soito and
Yeah,
soito.
sure.
And when I go to Italy, it's actually a word in Italian, means certainly.
You spend a
So
lot of time in Italy, or
I've, I've been, yeah, five or
okay.
six, maybe
Oh,
seven times now.
I've
Yeah.
never been to Italy.
I
Wonderful.
highly recommend it. It is a food fest
Oh,
and then some.
that I would be there for the scenery and the food. That'd be the main thing.
It's a
Yeah, it
beautiful
sounds
place.
awesome.
But my name
Wonderful.
in Italian is pronounced Certo, so
Ch
I'll leave it to you.
yeah, say it one more time.
Certo,
Certo,
Certo, Marco Certo. But
Marco
we're not in
Marco
Italy, and I don't
Certo.
imagine that you have a lot of Italian listeners, so it really won't matter.
No,
Mark
not
Certo works fine.
Certo. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here. Mark, I know that your current project, as far as what you were dealing with mostly for the time being, you are the host of Expanding on Consciousness. But so we're, of course, going to be talking about your background and your theories on consciousness. But it sounded like a lot of this journey began, at least professionally, with the Monroe Institute. But
Yes,
before we even start talking about that, let's talk about you first. Did something bring you to what brought you to this study? Why is it? What got you into the field of consciousness, studying consciousness? What did something happen? Let's hear the story.
the answer is yes, and it probably goes back to an experience that I had when I was just a kid. I had this experience, maybe 7 or 8 years old, where I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror, looking at my reflection as I'm just brushing away. And I saw a light in my eyes, which you would see, if you look deep enough into the reflection of your pupils, you'd see the light of the room, the ambient light in your eyes. And
Sure.
it made me wonder in just one brief moment, who is that? I never asked that question of myself. Most 7 or 8 year olds don't.
No,
Right.
no, they don't.
And for a moment, I was transfixed in that question and really didn't have an answer. It wasn't a dissociative experience, it was a curious experience. Like there was something beyond the visage that I was seeing, the reflection that I was seeing, something beyond the physical body. And of course, I shirked it off, as one would do, and just went about my day.
Yeah.
Um, that experience was probably the first of several little experiences in curiosity. By the time I reached about 15 years old, I had one of which I should probably back this up a little bit. One of which was an experience of hearing music, the music
Mm,
of Beatles specifically, for the very first time.
good.
I was a baseball fanatic as a kid, so I can actually see the scene in my mind's eye when I'm running down the stairs, preparing to exit the back door, and my mom is in the kitchen. She's doing dishes and listening to the radio, and there I am with my Mets cap on and my baseball glove, and I'm ready to go meet my friends to play. And I hear a song on the radio, and I stop dead in my tracks, and it was really a weird feeling, like pay attention. And I did for a moment. And I'm listening to this song playing, and I asked my mother, who is that on the radio? And she probably wasn't even aware that I was there until that very moment, and said, I think it's the Beatles. In that moment, I knew I was going to be a musician. I
Wow.
had I had no idea what a musician really was. I mean, as you could see behind me, I'm clearly a musician, right?
Clearly.
Clearly a musician. It was my North Star throughout my entire life. And I'll tell you why this pertains to your question. My career in music took me into just about every aspect of the music business there was, including being a performing artist, etc., and a musician. I became fascinated with the art of recording while I was living in Staten Island, New York. I got married at the age of 23. And another one of those, you, you just have to do this type of experiences, pay attention. I call them synchronicities, after Carl Jung, of course. Told me that I needed to move to Charlottesville, Virginia, and open up my recording studio,
That's very
which,
specific.
yeah, well,
Wow. Okay.
it was. I mean, I had visited Charlottesville during my honeymoon,
Yeah.
and my then wife, my first wife, and I just fell in love with the place. And we said, it's time to leave New York and move to Charlottesville. Never been to Charlottesville prior to that, but I found it a very enchanting town. I did not have any knowledge of the Monroe Institute at all at that point in time. But I did have a lot of meditation experience under my belt by that time. I was 24 years old,
Mm.
23, 24 years old.
Okay.
I'd been meditating since I was about 15 years old.
Okay.
And so we're talking about 1976, pretty fringe still in Western
Yes.
society. The reason I
Yes.
got involved in meditation was because I had read a book by a fellow named Jose Silva,
Oh, I know
which
that
was
name.
recommended out of an Omni magazine article that I had read that talked about the ability of mind to help you create the life you wanted to live.
Mm.
Not in some magical way necessarily, although that too can be debated and spoken about for a long period of time, but mostly because of the mental, emotional blocks that we create in our belief structures about this thing we call a self. I wanted to be a professional musician. So while I was in high school, I had these dreams of playing music for a living, simultaneously being told by the quote unquote authorities around me, you'll end up living on my couch for the
Yeah.
rest of your life.
Sure.
It's a
Yeah.
very tough life. You cannot make a living doing this. You'll end up
Yeah.
a heroin addict or whatever.
Right.
I didn't want any of that stuff. I wanted to succeed. And this article told me that I could succeed if I trained my mind to succeed.
Mm.
The path of self-actualization, using the mind to create the life you want to live. This meditation practice that was presented by Jose Silva was oriented towards that outcome. I had other experiences that were super conscious type of experiences, transcendental experiences.
That's
But
my bread and butter. That's
that was the thrust of my interest.
yeah.
So when I moved to Charlottesville, I went to Abbey Road Studios, and my father-in-law was a composer at the time, and he's recording with the London Symphony Orchestra. And Abbey Road is obviously a mecca for a Beatle fan, right?
Yes.
Jumped on the opportunity to go, came back, and I had a recording studio, created that in my home in Charlottesville. Took a couple of years, but it rolled out. And a phone call was left, or a message was left on my answering machine on 1980s, is that right?
Right.
And the voice on the answering machine simply said, old gentleman said, call Bob Monroe, and left the number. Well, I figured that Bob Monroe was senior citizen who called a recording engineer by mistake.
Mm,
But it turned out that was not the case at all. He was
no.
very intentional.
Yes.
He had told me when I called him that he had a recording studio and that they were doing a type of research that had to do with consciousness and consciousness expansion. He said, I don't know if you know anything about that. And I told him, well, I meditate. But
Yeah.
so anyway, Bob Monroe and I met. We fell in love with each other instantly. He was a great human being, maybe 50 years, 55 years my senior at that time. And that started an odyssey of consciousness exploration, especially with regards to expanded states from a very syncretic viewpoint, meaning it wasn't just about mysticism. It wasn't about just out-of-body experiences, which Bob Monroe which prompted his research into
Right.
consciousness,
Yes.
and he wrote about extensively. I also learned a great deal about human psychology. I learned a great deal about neurology and all of the multifaceted ideas about what this thing called consciousness was.
Can I let me
Needless to say, I was hooked. So please
clearly.
go.
So did you know at first why he contacted you as a person, as a sound engineer? What, was this explained at the very beginning, or could you?
No.
How did? Okay, I'm wondering, how did that
Yeah.
unfold? Like, why is he contacting me? Because there's a reason, obviously. What's the your natural connection there?
Ian, I never stopped to ask him while he
Oh,
was alive in the 7 years that we worked together. But
really?
I can tell you this. Bob was a very pragmatic person
Okay.
who had a bunch of anomalous experiences happen to him. He was not raised in a religious household. His mother was a physician, actually, and his father was a professor of Romance languages at the local college, Lexington, Kentucky. So Bob wasn't raised with any religious ideas whatsoever. When he started to have his out-of-body experiences, certain things, we'll call them esoteric wisdom, that result from such experiences prompted him into a language that he would sometimes reveal to me. Now, I knew this man, again, as a very pragmatic engineering type of person who also had an artistic bent. Okay, so we related on that level as well. He would sometimes say to me that there, or imply, he would give me what I call "you are here" speeches,
Mm,
telling me that there was a purpose behind our relationship and a purpose behind my being at the Monroe Institute, one of which I don't believe he was very, or most of which I don't believe he was very clear on, none of which I was clear at all on. I was
okay.
27 years old when we met.
Yeah.
I did not like him. I did not have any particular religious affiliations. I was raised Roman Catholic, but didn't stick. We'll
Yeah.
put it that way. But I was always a spiritually curious person. Bob, on the other hand, could care less about any religious dogma, and yet he had a sense that he and I had done this journey before,
Mm,
and he
okay.
implied it many times. And I would just look at him like, I love you, and I don't have any belief in reincarnation whatsoever.
Okay.
So
Right.
I hope that answers your question. The answer is I never really found out
Okay.
what prompted him to call me,
Yeah.
but the fact that I was there was obviously no accident, and that part was not lost on either of us.
Excellent. So what kind of work did you end up doing with him?
I was a recording engineer.
Okay.
So
So,
all of the hemisync recordings that were produced from the time I arrived, 1988, till the time I left in 2001, 13 years. Whether they were commercially available or done for research purposes or done for the programs at the Monroe Institute, I produced them
All right.
along with Bob Monroe.
Can you give us a brief breakdown when you say hemisync? What I'm sure that a lot of people have heard the term binaural beats. What are we talking about? What are they? What's the theory behind them?
I can speak a great deal on that.
I bet you could.
There are certain aspects that I will not reveal to you,
All
but
right.
I can start with the name hemisync.
Okay.
Bob Monroe actually created the first application of binaural beats
Yes.
for the purpose of stimulus, cortical stimulus, brain stimulus,
Mhm.
in order to invoke altered states of consciousness,
Right.
which is binaural beats.
Yes.
Binaural beats, as most people who scan on the YouTube will soon discover, and I want to make clear that every ounce of that material that you read originated with Bob Monroe.
Excellent.
He's just rarely credited for
Right.
obvious reasons. Okay.
Good. I wanted to make that clear. Good. Thank you.
For obvious reasons.
Yes.
Binaural beats are created through sine waves. Sine waves are used specifically because they are mathematically pure and very predictable. No harmonic overtones. Okay. It's a very annoying sound if you listen to a 1 kilohertz slate, for instance. When they do the emergency broadcast system,
Yes.
they use that tone, 1 kilohertz of frequency, 1,000 cycles a second, because that is the standard tone at the dead point center of the spectrum of human hearing, which is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz.
Okay.
Okay. So they use 1,000 hertz as the dead center. That's a standard test tone they'll use for all electronic circuitry that reproduces audio.
Okay. Interesting.
We don't use 1K because it's obviously very annoying, right? Brain waves fall into cycles per seconds too.
Okay.
They can be measured on EEG in that way. Most people have come to understand that there are brainwave consciousness correlations. The brainwave patterns that are understood and measured by EEG are delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. All right. There are implications about each one of those brainwave dominant patterns that are associated with states of consciousness and the phenomenology of experience. Okay.
Yes.
That is well documented science and precedes Bob Monroe. But Bob, being an engineer and having out of body experiences, not knowing how to control them, decided to use that known science and create what was called binaural beats. Binaural beats are created by sine waves. The process of way human beings hear and process sound is what enables binaural beats to have their effectiveness. So we're talking about a phenomenon. In the animal kingdom, if you have a dog or cat, you'll notice that their ears have movable pinnuas, right?
Right.
Sound goes in that direction, the dog's ears go in that direction. Unless you have an unusual talent of being able to wiggle your ears, right? We don't do it sound that way. And yet, if you were to close your eyes and I was to be in the same room and I took my fingers and I snapped them around your head, you could easily point to where my finger was, right?
Right.
How is that possible? The answer is to do with sound localization and the way our brain processes sound, okay? We process sound with 2 ears, stereo, and we can localize sound. When you put a pair of headphones on and you introduce 2 sine waves, one being, say, 100 hertz in the right ear
Right.
and 101 hertz in the left ear,
Okay.
there will be an oscillation that is produced based on our ability to process sound.
An oscillation in our brain waves.
An oscillation that begins at the auditory cortex.
Okay.
That oscillation is a differential between 100 hertz and 101 hertz.
Okay.
That differential is 1 hertz, right?
Okay.
Okay. That 1 hertz is something that is akin to the cycles per second within delta range of measured EEG patterns. Okay.
Okay.
Delta, the range, goes from 0.5 hertz to 3.5 hertz. So 1 hertz falls in that range.
Exactly. Makes sense.
Delta, right, is indicative of deep sleep experience or no experience. For instance, if a sleep pathologist, right, monitors you for a sleep disorder, they will watch you go into sleep, they refer to it now, where deep delta patterns are the predominance brainwaves being produced and measured. Okay.
Okay.
During delta sleep, we tend to lose consciousness completely. Lose consciousness defined as awareness.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
We lose awareness, right? We go into deep sleep.
Do you know if this is also the state that we go into under anesthesia, or by chance? I'm just curious.
I think it depends on the type of anesthesia given.
Oh.
Like with propofol, they call it twilight sleep, you know,
Okay.
when they
Just
use
curious.
propofol. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a different brainwave patterns would be my guess, but I've
Okay.
never taken propofol and I don't experiment using drugs.
Sure.
So.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha.
So binaural beats can be effective in producing deep sleep, light meditation, the hypnagogic state, concentration, hyperfocus of concentration, various transcendent experiences based on the hypnagogia or the hypnagogic state, which is the threshold between the subconscious and superconscious. There are multiple applications for the use of binaural beats, none of which you will find for free on YouTube.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah.
That does not imply that binaural beats do not work for that purpose.
Right.
It implies 2 things. Most of the people who use binaural beats on YouTube and give it away on YouTube are there for clickbait and, you know, getting their YouTube royalties.
Right.
That's not a bad thing. I'm a capitalist. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
However, the proper use of binaural beats should be based on research.
Okay.
The Monroe Institute has over 50 to 60 years of EEG research, both in-house in the lab where I was a recording engineer and in various clinical studies throughout the world in consciousness studies labs. So that's a caveat to those listeners who are out there who are trying to figure out, well, why should I pay for binaural beats when they're free on YouTube? Right. You know, if I was to be crude, I'd use a different word, but I'll just say, really, do you want other people? Do you want these guys really messing with your brains?
Right.
That's all I've got to say.
Yes.
And enough of that. That said, binaural beats do not do anything to you. Now, that may sound like a bit of a contradiction, right?
Okay.
I know this because I would be able to produce delta sleep frequencies, creating those recordings for that purpose of helping people to fall asleep or go into the hypnagogic state. Yet I was completely awake and aware.
Exactly. Right.
How is that possible? The answer, intention.
Ah, there we go.
In a simple word, right? I may not have been completely hyper focused on the task at hand. I may not have been completely sharp and hyper focused, but it was a relaxed focus and I was able to get my job done, right?
Right.
If I listen to that same recording with a pair of headphones with the intention of going into the hypnagogic state, boom, I'm there.
Gotcha.
So it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg question, right?
Mm.
Does consciousness and intention
Right.
produce the brainwave responses that we would reverse engineer off of EEGs to produce hemisync? Or does hemisync produce various states of consciousness? One thing I can tell you for certain is that the word hemisync, right, implied hemispheric synchronization.
Right.
That's what Bob was targeting. And the reason he was fascinated with that is because back in the early days of his research, he had a very crude EEG called a mind mirror. And a mind mirror was only a 4-channel EEG. And he would notice as he was producing these binaural beats, trying to come up with magical formulas that would suit various purposes, he would notice from time to time in the subjects that he was working with that the left and right hemisphere would lock together.
Right.
And at that point in time, we're talking about the late 1970s, the
Sure.
early 1980s, the idea of left and right brain as being separate and unique entities that had different functions. The right brain people are artistic and
Right.
creative and imaginative. Left brain people are very focused and,
Yes.
engineering types and very good at math. Right brain people can't finish a book. They
Right.
like to go from book to book to book without ever finishing. Left brain people are
Oh
they
yeah.
get stuck on a sentence, and the punctuation.
Yes.
All of those things are not necessarily true. They're grand generalizations of personality styles. More specifically, they're generalizations about brain function.
Mm.
But it was popular at the time. And Bob saw this synchronicity happening, this synchronization where the two hemispheres of the brain would act in unison
Right.
for moments. He was like, oh my God, the potential of this, given the current myth at the time, is astounding.
Mm.
For the first time in human history, we can create something through a technology that would give us superhuman brain power. And he called it hemisync
Good.
on account of that. So that's the history of hemisync. That's the history of binaural
Yes.
beats and a bit of information about application. I know it was long-winded, but
No, that's what I was looking for. We want to know what's going on with this. And I unfortunately I myself have only experimented with some of the junk binaural beats out there. And I've heard this before that I've not really had the real, I've not had access to the professionally created stuff off of solid research. And some of my experiences with meditating with some of these beats that I did find on YouTube were not good, I would say. I mean, in some cases I felt that I almost felt like I was going into a state of consciousness where I almost felt like I was having my brain scrambled a little bit and I didn't care for it. I'm like, well, whatever's going on, this is not, this is not what I'm looking for. And I that's when I started researching. Ah, okay, because I'm getting the junk stuff that's being made by, people who either don't know what they're doing or they don't, or it's not even a binaural beat to begin with. And, they're messing around with the hemispheres of your brain still on some level, perhaps that in ways that they don't really know what they're messing with. So that kind of tended to make sense to me.
well, if
So,
done inappropriately, they can actually trigger seizure activity in various individuals. So, I mean, there are certain ranges that producers, if you happen to be listening, there's certain ranges you want to avoid. And quite
yeah,
frankly, I'm not going to tell you what they are. You
okay,
need to do your own research.
yeah.
I want to encourage that actually, that they do their own research.
So, Mark, now you've been on this path of exploration of consciousness for many years now, as have I. So I want to talk more about your own personal experiences now that you've acquired in this field. First of all, let's start with the basics. Let's just start with consciousness. When we talk about consciousness, we had talked briefly before before we actually went into this recording, that sometimes I forget that people do have different ideas of what consciousness is. So often when we think of consciousness, they think, oh, well, that's me thinking to myself. That's my internal dialogue, right? Or people have this idea, oh, consciousness is my imagination when I'm, just thinking about different things, yada, yada, yada. When you think of the word consciousness, what does that mean to you?
It means a lot.
Okay.
So in the Western model of consciousness, what you had just spoken of is the definition of
Yep,
consciousness.
exactly.
The word awareness is synonymous with consciousness.
Mm.
And we use words like the patient is conscious, the patient is unconscious.
Right.
Right. Unconsciousness is as close to death or sleep as we can possibly get, right? When you're unconscious.
Yes.
So that is kind of denotes this on and off function, very binary
Right.
explanation of consciousness. The Eastern model of consciousness is more like a sea in which we swim.
Yes.
And Joseph Campbell, who I'm a big fan of,
Oh, yes.
I'll quote, said that the mystic swims in the sea. I'm paraphrasing. The psychotic drowns in the sea, where the mystic swims with delight.
Oh, okay.
Mystics swim in the sea of consciousness, this larger consciousness system, this unified consciousness system, because they move into what are called altered states of consciousness by the Western model. What is an altered state of consciousness? If,
Indeed.
in fact, consciousness is an on or off function. It's a very scientific term, altered states of consciousness. Well, then, those who study consciousness from the Western system can talk about things like hypnosis. They can talk about things like drug-induced hysteria. Some depth psychologists will, like Charlie Tart, for instance, who's the father of depth psychology and wrote these book called Altered States of Consciousness, which are studied by all those who are into depth psychology and taking that course material. He talks about even rage being an altered state of consciousness,
Oh,
where your anger takes over to such a degree that you're not yourself. Right?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. The different flavor, but kind of bleeds over into this notion of you becoming the psychotic who drowns in that sea. Usually, rage is brought on by an interrelational type of thing, right? Two people start bickering, and before you know it, you're enraged, or a situation happens, you're enraged. You're actually participating in something that began outside of you, a consciousness that you're interacting with. All right. So I can use that as a model.
Okay.
From the perspective of now, I'm a recording engineer. I'm
Right.
not a philosopher. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychologist. All of those folks who do consciousness studies, I'm not that. I'm a recording engineer. But because I am a recording engineer who surrounds myself with such things, and my job is to listen, I learn an awful lot. And I've created this model, very simplistic model, to answer your question. I don't know specifically what consciousness is,
Okay.
but the potential model for what we can explore is fairly simple and knowable. The triad mind is a compendium of 3 levels of consciousness which can be explored.
Okay.
One being the conscious mind, what we are aware of in the present moment. Okay?
Yes.
I'll start there. That consciousness can be expanded in what might be referred to as a mild altered state. You
Okay.
can do it right now. Want to try?
Sure.
Okay. You're sitting here and you're looking at me on Zoom, right?
Yep.
You have other senses that are also engaged. You're not paying any attention to whatsoever.
Sure.
Attention being a function of consciousness.
Right.
Okay. When you redirect your attention, and you will, you are able to shift consciousness, shift your attention.
Okay.
This notion of the Western model of consciousness is defined as consciousness is a compendium, meaning a blending, a mixing together,
Okay.
a mechanism of sensory input, sight, sound, feeling, right? Touch,
Okay.
all of our five physical senses, stimulating our cortices, brainwave,
Okay.
up on the top of our heads. These can be measured. It's a compendium of that incoming information combined with memory. So, in
Okay.
other words, the sound of my voice making these words only makes sense to you because you understand the words,
Right.
right?
Yes.
And you understand the words because literally they supposedly live in your memory cortex, right?
Yep.
That's the definition of consciousness in the Western model.
Mm-hmm.
As we expand the definition beyond the on-off function, right?
Yes.
So the conscious mind that I'm presenting in my simplistic model is to expand. It can be expanded through direct experience. Now, when somebody talks about an expanded state of awareness or an expanded consciousness,
Mm.
the average person listening starts thinking, ah, you're talking some mystical mumbo jumbo where I go into, but I'm a psychic and all of that
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Yes and no.
Okay.
And the reason I can say that with confidence is because as you are listening to my story of what the conscious mind is, right? You're hearing my words, you're making sense of them based on the lexicon of your understanding and your personal experience of consciousness.
Right.
You also see my image
Yes.
and the way that this Italian talks with his hands a lot, right? Tell me about the temperature in the room that you're in right now.
Probably about 72, somewhere in that area.
Were
Yeah.
you aware of it until I brought it to your attention?
No.
What
No.
about the seat that you're sitting in? How's your butt feeling on that seat right now?
Feels all right. I've got a nice memory foam underneath my ass right now, so I'm doing good.
All right.
Yeah.
But you can redirect your attention to this consciousness
Yes.
or to these sensory inputs and simultaneously pay attention to the words I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
That
Absolutely.
is an expanded state of consciousness.
Okay.
The ability to incorporate more sensory awareness,
Okay.
right?
Literally expanded. Yes. Okay.
Really simple thing, right? Very mundane experience, not mystical at all, right? However, there are these things that we'll call an altered state of consciousness.
Mm.
In science, Western science, they call it consciousness anomalies, like hypnosis
Yes.
or the experience of deep meditation, what the Hindu mystics would call yoga nidra, the sleep yoga, or
Yes.
transcendental experiences through meditation, right?
Yes.
A participation of within a ritual that Carl Jung spoke of, where he called it in French, it's called a participation mystique, the mystical participation. You go to a Sunday service, they have, if I was raised Catholic,
Yep.
you've got all the stained glass windows, you have the music, it's almost the unison of everybody singing, it's almost an ego transcendent experience, but you're not in a deep altered state, right?
Right. Yes.
But you have a frame of reference to how this works in the mundane. It gets really strange, these altered states, when you can take your awareness, your conscious sense of self, with as much sensory input as you can muster, because usually your eyes are closed, your ears are, you're wearing headphones in these with these binaural beat recordings, and you take your awareness downward into almost the point of sleep,
Mm,
where your body falls to sleep, your heart rate slows, your brainwave patterns slow, almost to the point. And we do this every night, and we
sure.
cross that threshold and we lose our conscious awareness, right?
Usually.
Right. If you
Right.
don't, if you're not insomniac, you know, it's a lot easier. In my case, I can be asleep in 15 minutes,
Okay.
but I tend to meditate at night, so I don't go to sleep for an hour and a half. I let my body sleep and keep my mind aware.
Exactly.
In that place, that substratum where the conscious mind is expanding to a place where it doesn't ordinarily go, where the subconscious material exists. We'll call that an entire realm below the conscious threshold, subconscious. Images begin to bubble up. And that imagery is referred to in sleep circles as the hypnagogic imagery.
Exactly.
That state of awareness is referred to as the hypnagogic state. That's a sleep pathology term that's opposed to hypnopompic imagery. Those dreams you remember when you wake up in the morning that dissipate within the first 5 minutes of your walking around if you don't pay attention and do a dream journal, right? In that deep meditative state, the subconscious can be explored consciously. That is not necessarily the sea in which the mystics were talking about swimming. That is more of a personal nature of subconscious memories, longings, desires, things that we tend not to think of, even though we can be self-reflective and find them should we do that, right? Choose to do that, bring our attention to them. Am I
Would
boring
you
you?
say this is would you say that this is basically a state of lucid dreaming or not, or are we not there yet?
No, you're not there yet because
Okay.
you did not go into deep delta
I
and then come
That's what
back
I
up.
figured. I was making sure that we are on the same page there. Okay. All right.
Right.
Okay.
We can talk about the differences between lucid dreaming and hypnagogia for hours too, but
I
this just
absolutely
gives you
right.
this model of
Yes,
consciousness
yes,
that I'm
yes,
trying to present on a simple
yes,
platform.
yes.
The cool thing about training yourself to go into hypnagogia is twofold. One, you get to explore more of what resides in your personal subconscious. It can also act as a springboard for a transcendental experience. What are we talking about transcending? We're talking about the ego. We're going to have to define what that is, right?
Exactly.
What is, let's call it just a sense of self for
Good.
now,
Yeah.
a sense of self that's familiar to you. People who do deep meditation practices, who practice transcendental meditation, who listen to binaural beats and that were responsibly created for the purpose of having such experiences as the out of body experience, the samadhi experience, some unified experience where you know through direct experience that there was no way that my subconscious could have made this up.
Mm,
All
okay.
right.
All right.
I talk to people like, folks who are not only depth psychologists who understand the benefits of such experiences, but also scientists who study near death experiences. I
Yes.
just had a conversation with Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is director of the Cognitive Studies Lab. I'm sure I'm messing up his exact title
Mm,
at UVA, and he's written a book on his decades of studying near-death experiences. I'm slated to talk to Raymond Moody, who preceded him. These people are of a medical background. They
Yes.
are medical doctors who are in the field of psychiatry,
Mhm.
who are taking this seriously because they cannot deny the accuracy and the impact that it has on the human psyche. People who have near-death experiences or transcendental experiences understand something about life that your average citizen who has not had those experiences does not. One, they do not fear their death.
I was hoping you were going to bring that up first. I love it. Great.
They don't even believe that death exists anymore.
Right.
They
Right.
understand something about the nature of their lives and the
Yes.
purpose of their lives. It changes their interpersonal relationships between all the people in their life and indeed to life itself. It's of extreme value. So those are the three stratum of consciousness that I, in my oversimplified model,
Mm.
have created for the purpose of exploration. The reason I do this are twofold: self-actualization and self-realization.
Okay.
That's it. That's my definition of consciousness,
Wonderful.
above it, on and off.
So you're using a lot of terminology that I'm trying to connect to. So let's see if I can put this together with from my experiences. I began lucid, what they call lucid dreaming, somewhere when I was around the age of 19. Actually, it was before that, but I had forgotten that I was doing it when I was a child. I
Mhm.
didn't remember that I was doing this until much later.
Right.
Lucid dreaming. Now, again, this was back late 80s, somewhere around there, early 90s. We didn't really have the internet. I wasn't really able to just go online and go Google this kind of stuff. So I was kind of left to my own device to go figure out what the heck's going on. And what I found was that as these lucid dreaming experiences continued, eventually I started finding that things that I was seeing in some of these states were things that were actually happening in the daily world, right? When I was asleep, and I was able to later confirm these things with other people, and that really flipped me out because I'm in my mind I'm like trying to understand. Wait a minute, okay, I could accept lucid dreaming, the concept, the idea that I am somehow retaining an awareness and I am retaining a consciousness in an area that most people do not, in the dream state where normally you are just kind of being pulled along by some dream narrative, right? But in lucid dreaming, I was able to pull back from all of that and go, oh, I see, I understand I'm in a dream. I understand what's going on. But then I found from that point, somehow I was moving into an area that we tend to call astral projection, for lack of a better phrase. And I could not, for the life of me at the time, figure out what could possibly be the connection between these lucid dreams and these out of body states of experiences. And so, it sounds like you now, you have had enough experiences where, would you say that you yourself, it sounds like you have experienced out of body states. It sounds like what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, well, okay.
Uh,
How do you put it? Like, how do you see? Because I did, in many ways, one of the reasons I feel like I connect to Robert Monroe is because I also didn't grow up in a religious family or a spiritual family or anything like that. So I took these experiences as they came, and I didn't buy into any narrative from even the spiritual groups or anything. I found a lot of new age books that were telling me all about, like,
right.
well, in an astral projection, your soul leaves your body and there's a little silver thread, and they have the whole narrative around it, which, I'm like, well, I don't know if I buy that either. Uh and I and so my question to you is, it sounds like you're also maybe hesitant to use these words like astral projection. What do you make of, what do you feel is going on in these states where people are going, you know,
I love your
I'm able
line.
to observe. I'm able to observe what's going on when my body should not be able to observe, you know, what's going on in other places. What's going on there?
Right. Um, I love your line of questioning, first of all. I wish I had a definitive answer because it would make me sound like some kind of groovy, enlightened dude who has the secrets to life in his back pocket. But I really,
I don't know is a wonderfully honest answer, and I love that answer. More people should get comfortable using that answer. So please continue.
I'll tell you why I don't know.
Okay.
All right. You would think after spending decades that I
Right.
might know something about it.
Okay.
So, yes, I've had transcendent experiences.
All right.
I have had lucid dreams.
Yes.
All right. I theoretically had an out of body experience or 20 million. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
So I'll give you a background with experience, my personal experience. One time, again, I'm 28 years old. I'm hanging out with Mr. Out of Body Experience. All right.
Right.
I know this fella. We
Yeah.
hang out for hours and we are buds. Okay. So one day I'm trying to work all of these questions out because by this point in time, I had had numerous lucid dream experiences. Okay. And I understood the potential and power of them. I could actually induce them too. Very different from out of body experiences.
Yeah.
So one time I had a dream and I told it to Bob Monroe. I said, Bob, I had this dream last night. Maybe you can help me understand this. I woke up out of my bed and I was very thirsty. So I go downstairs into my kitchen and I open up my refrigerator door and um, there's maybe a quarter of a bottle of apple juice there. And man, I just chugged it down while the refrigerator door was open. I could actually feel how good it felt to go, and I was parched, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Finished that off, put it on the kitchen counter, went upstairs, stopped at the restroom, did my thing, went back to bed, fell asleep. 5 minutes later, I woke up. I'm guessing it was 5 minutes, what felt like 5 minutes.
Sure.
I woke up completely parched. I go downstairs. I go open up the refrigerator door. There's a quarter bottle of apple juice there. I chug it down with the leaning on the refrigerator door, relishing the cool feeling going down my throat. Very visceral experience.
Yeah.
Go back upstairs, relieve myself in the bathroom, go to bed. And before I fall asleep again, as I'm going into that hypnagogic state, it occurs to me, I just did this. All right. So I'm telling this story to Bob Monroe.
Yeah.
And he's laughing.
Yeah.
And he loved to laugh at me because I was a kid. He used to call me kid all the time.
All right.
And I said, so Bob, what was that? A precognitive dream? Was it a lucid dream? He said, no, you had an out of body experience. I said, how do you know?
Yeah.
How do you know? Because this wasn't the type of experience that Bob would have,
Right.
where he'd leave his body, right, and
Mhm.
find himself banging up against the ceiling and then take off out the window, or like so many other people report.
Right.
It wasn't a lucid dream. I mean, I didn't have the dream experience of going down into the kitchen. I literally did it twice
Right.
in some kind of weird way
Yes.
that I can't explain.
Yeah.
And I had enough lucid dreams to explain that. And he said, you know what, kid, you're not going to be able to figure that out through your thinking.
Okay.
All you're going to be able to do is continue to be curious about the nature of experience.
Oh, wow.
All right.
That alone drives people nuts, that they, you know, that's sort of, you know, they want
They want,
ground beneath their feet. They
right.
want solid answers. And that really bothers people when, and for me, the older I've got, the more experience I've picked up, I love those answers because they're honest. That's what, that's what it is. We sometimes you just have to pay attention to the experience. Like, you may not get a final conclusion, a solution at the end. I love it.
But it goes back to what we were talking about with regards to ego, right?
Okay.
Ego enables anyone to have an experience.
Mhm.
Without an ego, you become that drop of water falling from the sky into the ocean
Yes.
and get
Right.
dissolved, right?
Right. Right.
You become part of that sea in which we all swim.
Yeah.
With an ego, it necessitates a subject and object split.
Yes.
That subject object split takes place in space,
Mhm.
and you can have an experience.
Yep.
I am having an experience of you. You are having an experience of me.
Right.
Resonate, right? We talk, we get to know each other, right? This is occurring with everything in everybody's life all the time. You're having an experience with the air around you. You
Sure.
just don't know it
Mhm.
until you direct your attention to it, right?
Yes. Right.
That same thing applies to every facet of one's life.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
ego likes to believe that it understands the nature of experience,
Mhm.
right? It
Sure.
does. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Why?
yeah. Absolutely.
Because of sensory input and the memory cortex and all that. I know who I am.
Yeah.
I knew who I was at 7,
Yeah.
right? I knew who I was again at 21. I knew who I was again at 42, each one being a different phase in my life,
Right.
right? Each one having a whole different frame of reference based on experience. And I grow and I evolve just
Mhm.
like everybody else.
Yeah.
Yet there are parts of me that don't grow and evolve, right? We call those the essential nature of my ego self. I've always been Mark,
Okay. All right.
and I've always been a musician, right? These
Mhm.
things I land on. You take these things away from me, right? Like with Alzheimer's, can't remember my name, can't remember
Yeah.
that I ever played guitar. Who am I, right?
Yes.
And what
Yes.
does that invoke in the ego? Fear.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
terrifying. That's why we land. That's why we don't grow. That's why we don't change. If you can do this work consciously and with intention, you do grow, you do change, you do move forward in your understanding of this thing called a self, this thing called an ego. And you come to realize, that's why I call it self-actualization and self-realization. This thing called the self, this ego, is climbing this ladder of evolution for one singular purpose: experience.
Okay.
And it fears the notion of no experience, death,
Mm.
becoming that drop of water in the ocean
Yes.
where there is no individuation. But if you talk to anybody who's had a near death experience or a transcendental experience or an out of body experience or continues to have them, they understand something about that that the average citizen does not understand, and yet is trying to understand because they go to religious services.
Mm.
They hold deeply held beliefs about
Yes.
what happens. Why does anybody do a spiritual search? They're looking for the truth of self,
Yes.
as self will exist beyond the familiar self.
Mm.
This triad mind and the Monroe Institute is about having those experiences without the dogma and ritual of any particular spiritual discipline,
Mm.
because it's science based, in as much as we can have a science about such things. The science of self is,
So, and I
another
and I
thing.
don't thank you for all of that, but that brings me to another little side quest, if you will, when we talk about the idea of this being a science or trying to apply scientific methodology, that is something that I've really tried to do with all of my experiences over the years. I've tried to take everything I've that has happened to me, and I've tried to say, okay, well, what happens if I apply a critical thinking to this and logic? Does this whole thing fall apart? And it sounds like even the government at one point, tried to study some of this phenomena to the best of their ability. And we kind of talked a little bit about, I believe it was called the Stargate project, where was it the CIA was trying to look into some of these principles, the idea of, is out-of-body experiences possible? Now, who knows what their reasoning for diving into this stuff was, but I guess my ultimate question is, from everything that you've seen, from everything that you've researched over the years, do you feel that anyone has really ever managed to scientifically prove the out-of-body experience to some degree, or come close to it? Or do you think that's even possible to happen, to prove by any sort of critical standards, using scientific methodologies?
Yes, it's hard.
Why is it hard? Can you answer that?
Yeah, first you have to have somebody who can have a clinically verifiable out-of-body experience. What is
Yes.
a clinically verifiable out-of-body experience? The ability to leave one's body,
Yep.
retain consciousness,
Yes.
and be able to identify something
Yep.
that is happening in the material world. Because
Yep.
if you do it in the immaterial or astral world, the world of phantasm,
Right.
you can't
Yeah.
clinically verify it.
Exactly. Right.
So those two things are necessary. Some
Yep.
people claim that they have out-of-body experiences all the time,
Yep.
and they go directly to the world of angels.
Yes.
They
Yes.
can't stay in the material world. However, my friend and mentor, Bob Monroe, had that ability,
Yeah.
and he did in our lab
Good.
do that.
All right.
He was not able to do that in other lab situations.
That doesn't
Not that he
surprise me.
not that he wasn't able to leave his body.
Right.
He would just find himself and stay within the realm of the physical time space,
Yep.
right? It's just he would redirect himself away from the target.
Mm.
For instance, the target might be a series of numbers that the clinician left way out of his purview
Sure.
of his physical body,
Exactly.
right? Unfortunately, Bob would be directed to a conversation that was happening in the hall outside the room that he was in. And he'd be able to talk about that conversation,
Right.
but not necessarily read the numbers.
It seems to
Okay.
me, and I bet, and I'm sure that you have a theory on this, but it has always seemed to me that in order to get into that state, personally, I am basically shedding so much of the ego, all of the parts of my psyche that are even interested or invested in proving astral projection to somebody else to begin with, on some level, if that makes sense. It's like almost I have to necessarily drop all of that first, and then you're asking me to go into this state and somehow retain some concern or a focus on, well, go find those numbers or whatever it is. And I find that whatever it is that's moving beyond the ego and all of that, the consciousness that is still moving beyond that, has zero interest on anything that that I can even communicate with, if that makes sense. There's not a transfer, and I always felt that it seemed to me that anyone who tried to prove these states is going to run into that same situation. They're going to find themselves like, well, okay, now once I go into this state of awareness, this state of consciousness, well, that state of consciousness doesn't have any of the values that my ego did that set this experiment up to begin with. What's your take on that?
All of that is completely true.
Yeah,
And yet
yeah,
there are other psi experiments that seem to indicate that that doesn't necessarily hold as fact
okay,
when it comes to things like the clairvoyance of reading numbers, which aren't, or gathering any information
yeah,
that is not within your sensory purview. One of which pertains to that thing that you were talking about with regards to Stargate and the CIA. It's not just the CIA that was doing this, it's also the Defense Intelligence
of course.
Agency, the DoD. I mean, we're talking about in defense intelligence gathering.
Right.
And that was done by a group of individuals over at Stanford Research who were doing psi experiments on this thing called scientific remote viewing.
Right.
Which was started by a very talented psychic, for lack of a better word, called Ingo Swann. Ingo would not be, apparently, I never worked with the man, but apparently he would be able to remote view, meaning target something that was based on a set of map coordinates.
Yeah.
All right. For instance, I'm going to say, okay, 90 degrees north, 2 minutes, 13 seconds. I don't know map coordinates, but you know, it's language that makes no sense to the conscious mind. And there's no way you could study the globe and identify what, you know, tell me what's happening there right now.
Right.
And Ingo would just sit there with a cigar, apparently, wide awake, and begin to draw what he saw in his mind's eye while his eyes were wide open. So his consciousness was obviously split, right? And he wasn't, if that's probably an altered state of consciousness, but it's not the hypnagogic state, and he wasn't out of his body, you know, so what was occurring there? That makes the whole of psi, PSI research, not only very interesting, but brings up more questions than answers.
Yes.
We cannot figure out the mechanisms behind these things, and teaching them to another person is very difficult. Very difficult.
Yeah.
Because of what you just said. You have to let go, you have to suspend your disbelief that you can do this, because anybody apparently can do this. Then you have to go through these varied, I won't call them rituals, but develop your own sense of process around it. So we could call it a ritual. And then detach yourself from immediate judgment and landing on the data coming in. That too is an ego function that's very difficult to come through, you know. So when you're talking about psi experiences and psi functioning and clinical research around it and trying to ascertain the mechanisms behind it, let alone teaching someone else to do it, sorry, new age gurus, but we're on to you. You know, if you're teaching this, I'd really like to see what kind of results you're getting. You know? In the same way, I'd like to see how a yogi might be able to levitate 4 feet off the floor. You know, I've never seen that.
No, me either.
I don't see it, but that doesn't mean these things aren't occurring.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that these things can't be researched. And they had been.
Yes.
The federal government, the United States government, in several different departments, availed itself of many psychics for information gathering during the Stargate program. I had the pleasure of not only knowing him, working with a couple of them, not as a remote viewer, but various projects, but also one of the head researchers there was the head researcher at the Monroe Institute. So I got to be privy to some of the language, and all of that stuff that people see on TikTok by all of the many influencers who probably weren't even born when the project was taking
Right,
place,
right.
but seemed to know all about it from reading the CIA documents.
Sure.
And, get 1 million followers and 1 million likes because it's all very entertaining. Don't really understand what was happening. The remote viewing program was a brainchild of Ingo Swann, the folks at SRI, a few key others, for the purpose of intelligence gathering because the Soviet Union was also involved in it. And
Yeah.
at that point in our paranoid history, which we may be moving into once again,
I
if
think we're
the
there.
if the
Yeah.
Russians are doing it, we
Right.
have to do it too. There needs to be
Yes.
a countermeasure. Okay.
Absolutely.
So that prompted a lot of questions about consciousness. As a sidebar to the remote viewing intelligence gathering, there was also this notion that probably was a carryover from the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Do
Oh,
you know it?
oh yes. Well, I know this what the claims about what happened to that ship, but
Right.
what actually happened. I mean, I've heard lots of different tales, but yeah, I know the
The
basics.
idea that consciousness and energy can be used to manipulate matter
Yes.
is, let alone time space, right,
Right. Right.
is a theoretical physics possibility.
Hmm?
In the world of quantum theory, and
Right.
believe me, we're getting way outside of
No,
my
it's all right.
purview of understanding because I'm not a quantum field theorist, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
when you write those hieroglyphics on the blackboard, I start drooling. I have
I
no
got
idea
you.
what you're saying to me.
I'm right there with you.
But theoretically, consciousness itself does not actually live inside the body. In the same way that time space is illusory and in some strange way held together by attention and observation functions of consciousness.
Yeah.
Not definitely, not necessarily human consciousness. Don't want to make the universe anthrocentric, right?
Yes. Right.
The universe is bigger than us.
Yeah.
But those theories are reflected in that CIA document. And because Bob Monroe was working on a very scientific method to put people into altered states of consciousness without introducing LSD, which we all know the CIA had done before
Absolutely.
as a psyop, right? This is a very different thing. So that was the theory behind those CIA documents that had become declassified.
Yeah.
Did they work? There's a wonderful movie called Men Who Stare at Goats.
Oh yes. Oh
You ever see
yes.
that movie?
Oh, I've seen it a couple of times. Sure.
I knew those guys,
Nice.
not the actors, but
Right. No, I know.
the
Yeah,
men who were staring at
the
goats.
original ones. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't walk through walls with your physical body.
Right.
If that were possible, then Will Smith could never have slapped Chris Rock in the face. His
Yes.
hand would have went right through.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
on some footage, it appears that it did, right? That
Oh, interesting.
it wasn't a real slap, in other
Oh
words.
gosh, interesting.
I
I've not
I'm
heard that one yet.
it's a joke. It's a
Yes.
joke. I'm sure that Chris Rock got hit.
Yeah, it looked
The
like
question
it.
the questions that we're asking here, Ian, are so entertaining.
They are.
And there's nothing wrong with that, in my
Sure.
opinion.
No.
But there's a huge difference between what is theoretically possible, what is scientifically applicable,
Yes.
and entertainment.
Yeah. Mm,
I tend to be in the latter
yeah.
quadrants,
Okay.
you know. I'm not here to entertain anybody. I'm here to use consciousness and to teach people to explore and use consciousness for the purposes of self-actualization and self-realization. Very practical and simultaneously spiritually uplifting types of
Yes.
experiences. And that's the legacy I carry on with from Bob Monroe.
Excellent. Well, excellent responses all the way around. Mark, you and I could talk for hours. I want to ask you one final question before we wrap this up, and that's that for someone on a path who, they're exploring these things, they're curious about meditation and consciousness. What advice might you give someone if someone was saying, I want to somehow, you know, get into this. I want my own experiences. What would you recommend for an
Step
explorer,
one.
for the curious traveler?
Step one, understand your motivation.
Oh,
If you
yes.
understand your motivation, at least that much,
Yeah.
that'll help you find the right path.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
You know, if you are of the mind that you don't necessarily want to become part of any religious tradition that's outside of the one that you're comfortable with or any whatsoever, you're raised a Catholic and you're interested in meditation and exploring consciousness, you might not want to join a Hindu ashram,
Right.
you know, but
Right.
yoga would be okay for you. I mean, there's all kinds of gray areas here now
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
that didn't exist when I was first getting started. If
Mm.
you are looking to learn how to explore the hypnagogic state, explore subconscious content to relieve hidden belief structures, to reprogram your subconscious construct of self, and perhaps experience something other than the familiar self, to alleviate your fears of death, perhaps strengthen your connection to divinity. The Triad Mind is very much available. www.thetriadmind.com.
That's going to be right down there.
I use binaural beats to teach you how to do that. And it's also couched in a language that is philosophically neutral and non-dogmatic. So it
Wonderful.
doesn't matter what you bring to the table, you can apply that to these ideas. That
Wonderful.
too is a carryover from the Monroe Institute.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly recommend the work at the Monroe Institute. If you have the ability to go to the campus and
Mm.
stay for 6 nights and 5 days, it's an experience that you won't soon forget.
Oh, I bet.
I will put it that simply. Not
Oh.
everybody can do that, but the Monroe Institute also holds virtual programs
Mm.
that make it easier for people to do and easier on the pocketbook.
Gotcha. Right.
But to answer your question specifically, if you know your motive, be curious,
Yes.
practice. Doesn't matter what the discipline is or how you employ it. If you do it with authenticity and a curious mind, you're going to make some pretty interesting strides. If you're doing it for a form of aggrandizement,
Mm.
I can guarantee you, you're going to fall flat on your face.
Yeah.
Choice is yours. If
It's
you're doing it for a form of entertainment,
yeah.
you might find it entertaining for a time, but
Yeah.
it'd be like watching the same movie 9, 12 times. Eventually, you get to know every line, and it's like, who cares anymore, right?
Yes.
I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but it's the most authentic that I have.
That's what I
And
like.
there's advice.
And last but not least, tell us about what are your current projects right now? If someone wants to catch you on your current work, where could they find you? What are you working on right now?
Well, if you are interested in the conversation of consciousness from not only the Eastern but Western model, if you're interested in the psi research, if you're interested in all the implications of quantum field theory as it applies to consciousness. If you're interested in psychic phenomenon, if you're interested in psychology, all of these things apply to consciousness. I highly recommend that you start listening to the Expanding on Consciousness podcast. I have the incredible blessing to be able to have these in-depth conversations with people who are much smarter than I am. I learned something new about their work and them as human beings with each time I speak to them. And I just feel like it's an amazing position to be. That podcast can be found on all the aggregates, Apple,
Right. And I'll put
Spotify.
there will be links for all of these things in the description below, so we can find all of those there as well.
And the TRIAD Mind is a 3-stage program. So stage 1 is currently being taught as a home study course. Cost is $333 because I love the number 3. TRIAD, right? 333.
Makes sense.
You have it for 6 months and you can study, and you and I will have a dialogue by email. You'll also be invited to my online presentations whenever I give them. I call them the observances.
Yes.
Right. That said, there's also the residential programs that are available at the Monroe Institute. I'm now proud to say that the TRIAD Mind is being presented there. Next Friday, I leave for the Monroe Institute. That's March the 17th. We'll be running it through the 24th. I also have one coming up in July, and I believe the dates are like the 28th through August 6th.
Okay.
That's late July.
Late July. Okay.
The other 2 programs out of the 3 stages of the TRIAD Mind are in production, and I'll be teaching those as well. So thank you for asking. And
Absolutely.
I got to tell you, Ian, it's been a great conversation. I hope
Absolutely. Yes.
talk
Thank
too
you.
much.
Thank you so much. We're gonna end this here. Don't go anywhere for a second, Mark. We want to touch base after this, but thank you so much for coming on my show. This was a wonderful conversation. This has been really enlightening. Very much appreciate you taking your time for me.
Well, the pleasure is mine, and to
All
your
right.
audience, stay
All right.
curious,
All right. Thanks so much. We